morning, everyone. Welcome to Income Taxation. This is Gisrel H. Raz, your instructor for today. So today we'll discuss gross income. To anything about gross income, its sources and components and how it is computed. So we'll discuss that in this lesson. However, this lesson is divided into several videos and parts. So for this video, we'll focus on the classification of the taxpayers, particularly the individual taxpayers. At the end of this lesson, you'll be able to classify the individual taxpayers in their tax situs, and of course, identify the items included and excluded in the gross income of the taxpayer, classify a taxable and non-taxable income, categorize which income is subject to normal tax and final tax, and finally, to compute the gross income and non-taxable income in accordance with the tax code. So if you're ready, let's jump in. So before we begin our computation on what is excluded and what is included in the gross income, let us first understand who is a taxpayer. So a taxpayer is someone who is required by the law to file and pay their tax as imposed and prescribed by the National Internal Revenue Code. A taxpayer may be classified as an individual taxpayer or a corporate taxpayer. When you say individual taxpayer, this is a natural person, of course, with life, living, okay? And when you say corporate taxpayer, this is an artificial being, or it could be a corporation or a partnership. Okay, so in this video, in this lesson, we will focus our discussion on the individual taxpayers because we'll have a separate discussion on corporate taxpayers. Okay, so uh, the individual taxpayers may be classified depending on their citizenship and residence. Okay, so the taxpayers' residence and citizenship must be identified properly to account incomes which are subject to income tax. The situs or the location of taxation depends on the taxpayer's residency and citizenship. The individual taxpayers are classified into five, okay? So we have first, he can be a resident citizen or RC, or a non-resident citizen or NRC, or he can be a resident alien, or a non-resident alien engaged in trade or business or NRA-ATB. Or finally, a taxpayer can also be a non-resident alien not engaged in trade or business or NRA and ETB. So these are the five classification of an individual taxpayers. So we'll discuss each of them later on. So a resident citizen is someone who is both a citizen and a resident of the Philippines, like you. You're a resident, you are residing, you are living in the Philippines, and also you are a Filipino. Therefore, you are considered as a resident citizen. Okay? So, in particular, to qualify for citizenship, one must have met any of the following requirements. So, there are several requirements. So, first, those who are citizens in the Philippines at the time of the adoption of the Philippine Constitution in 1987. So, any person who are classified as citizens at the time of the adoption of the Philippine Constitution in 1987 are considered as citizen. And those whose fathers or mothers are citizens of the Philippines. So if your mother is a Filipina or your father is a Filipino, then you are also a citizen of the Philippines. And those born on January 17, 1973, of Filipino mothers who elect Philippine citizenship upon reaching the age of majority, or those who are naturalized in accordance with the law. So any foreigner or any non-Filipinos originally who have naturalized their citizenship are also now considered as citizen of the Philippines. So when you say resident and citizen, you must be living in the Philippines, you must be residing in the Philippines, and must have the citizenship status of being a Filipino. Okay, so next is a non-resident citizen. A non-resident citizen is someone who establishes to the satisfaction of the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue the fact of their physical presence abroad with a definite intention to reside therein. So if you want to stay therein for a long period of time and then you intend to reside therein, then you can be considered as a non-resident citizen of the Philippines, or those who lives in the Philippines during the taxable year to reside abroad, either as an immigrant or for employment on a permanent basis. Say, for example, an overseas Filipino worker. So OFWs are considered as non-resident citizens because of the nature of their employment requires them to stay in the outside of the Philippines, or those who stays outside in the Philippines for more than 183 days. So if you are staying outside the Philippines for more than 183 days, then you are considered as a non-resident citizen of the Philippines. 183 days, actually 6 months. Okay? Next, we have the resident alien. So, resident alien is a foreigner, not an alien per se, which is outside of this planet. Okay, so resident aliens are foreign persons who have acquired residency in the Philippines. So those foreigners who have acquired residency in the Philippines are considered as resident aliens. So as a rule, foreign persons are considered as residents when the length of their stay or assignments in case of work are indefinite, or those who have resided for exceeding 2 years under the BAR rulings number 051 to 81-81 and 052-81. Okay? So 2 years. Like non-resident citizens, resident aliens are also taxed for incomes derived within the Philippines only. So by the way, resident aliens and non-resident citizens are only subject to tax for their incomes derived in the Philippines, unlike resident citizens whose incomes abroad and incomes within the Philippines are taxed globally. Okay, so altogether. So again, the resident alien and non-resident citizens are taxed only for their incomes within the Philippines. Incomes derived abroad are not subject to Philippine taxation. So next we have the non-resident alien engaged in trade or business. A non-resident alien individual is a foreign person who have not acquired residency in the Philippines, meaning he have not stayed for more than 2 years in the Philippines, as what the resident alien did. So any person who have not acquired residency but are doing business in the Philippines shall be considered as engaged in trade. So any person who shall come to the Philippines and stay herein for an aggregate period of more than 180 days, meaning more than 6 months, during any calendar year, shall be deemed as doing business in the Philippines. Like the non-resident citizen and resident aliens, the non-resident alien engaged in trade or business is also taxed for his or her incomes derived within the Philippines only. So any incomes derived abroad shall not be taxed in the Philippines. Finally, we have the non-resident alien not engaged in trade or business. Any foreign person who shall come in the Philippines and stay herein for an aggregate period of not more than 6 months or not more than 180 days during any calendar year shall be deemed as not doing business in the Philippines. For example, tourists. They are taxed on their incomes derived within the Philippines at only at 25% of the total gross income. So any foreign person who comes in the Philippines and stay here in for not more than 6 months, and in case they earn incomes, they will be taxed at 25% in their total gross income. And this 25% is actually a final tax. So before they would receive their incomes, the payer of such income, so any payer of such income, shall withhold first the 25%, meaning shall deduct the 25% beforehand before this income will be paid to the non-resident alien not engaged in trade. So to summarize, we'll have this illustration. We have the income from sources within the Philippines. This is the situs. Okay, when you say situs, meaning the source or the location. and then income from sources outside the Philippines. So for resident citizen, any income derived within the Philippines shall be taxable using the normal tax. When I say normal tax, this means the graduated rates or the 8% optional rate or the final tax. And any income from outside of the Philippines shall be also taxable if you are a resident citizen. However, if you are a non-resident citizen, any incomes from sources within the Philippines shall be taxable. When you say non-resident citizen, these again are Filipino citizen who are not residing in the Philippines or who have resided in outside of the Philippines, such as OFWs and immigrants. Okay, so they would be taxable only if they derived income from within the Philippines. So any income from sources outside of the Philippines shall not be taxable in the Philippines. Of course, these incomes coming from outside the Philippines shall be taxed on the country or location where these income are derived. But for Philippine taxation purposes, these incomes derived abroad are not subject to income tax. Okay? Also, for resident alien, these are foreign persons. These are non-residents. These are non-Filipinos but have acquired residency in the Philippines. They are also subject to tax for their incomes derived within the Philippines. Okay? And then any sources or any incomes from sources outside of the Philippines shall also be non-taxable. So, for example, if you are a foreigner, if you are not a Filipino, and then you have stayed here for more than 2 years, then you would be considered as resident alien. And then any incomes derived in the Philippines shall be taxed in the Philippines, but your income from sources abroad shall not be taxable in the Philippines. Also, for non-resident alien not engaged in trade or business, the same is true for income from sources within the Philippines and for income from source outside the Philippines. So actually, the other four taxpayers follow the same patterns. So for non-resident alien not engaged in trade or business, again, they would be taxable only if their incomes are from the Philippines. If their incomes are from outside of the Philippines, they would not be taxable in the Philippines. Okay? So, when I say non-taxable, again, it doesn't mean that they are entirely non-taxable. It just means that for Philippine taxation, these incomes derived abroad are not subject to Philippine taxation. But of course, the country wherein that income was derived will impose a tax on such income. And the unique part of the non-resident alien not engaged in trade or business is that all their incomes, whether from whatever source in the Philippines, shall be taxed at 25% final tax. So be it a compensation or business or whatever. So any income derived by a non-resident alien not engaged in trade or business shall always be subject to 25% final tax. When we say final tax, these are withhold before the taxpayer receive the income. Okay, so after you have understand the classification and tax status of the different taxpayers, individual taxpayers, now let us proceed to the different types of income.